Misambolo binaka talofalava, kona mauri, fakatalofa yakwe, today bekemani namatuga manawa specifica. Respectful greetings to my Pacific Island relatives from around the region and to our audience tuning in from around the world, and welcome. My name is Salat Songo, and I'm honored to be moderating this panel today as a Pacific Island daughter, a human rights and climate justice activist. I am with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is an international human rights organization that works to dismantle systems of oppression and advance human rights around the world. And we're proud to be a part of this event with the esteemed panelists that will be speaking today. The title of this event is The Climate Crisis and Loss and Damage: How Resilient Are Our Frontline Communities and What is Happening to Us? This event is organized as part of the COP26 Resilience Hub, which is described as a home of our race to resilience. We understand that the outcomes of our discussions today and all the events happening in the Resilience Hub will be presented to the high-level COP26 and COP27 champions. So this discussion is important not only in sharing our experiences and our resilience, but also in building the political will for our leaders in Glasgow to act. Because resilience, the Pacific's resilience in particular, is necessary for our survival as a region. And we would like to thank Christine Fung at the GIZ, and the rest of the organizers for inviting us to participate here. So without further ado, let's get started. To kick us off, we'll hear directly from 3 leaders in Fiji who are already seeing loss and damage in their communities. In the interest of time, I will not read out the panelists' biographies, so I encourage you all to review their bios in our flyer, which I will add to the chat. So let me just add to the chat a flyer of our speakers, so you can see their amazing bios. So I hope you can see it now. And to kick us off, I'm going to show another slide that better describes where our community leaders will be calling from. I hope you can all see this slide. This slide shows the geographic locations of these 3 community leaders in Fiji. For those of you who are not familiar, you will hear from Kelepi Saukitonga from the village of Narikoso in Kandavu, who will be speaking about his community. Kelepi's village is right at the very bottom of the map. You will also hear from Petero, who will be speaking about Tunuloa in the Kaunrove. Petero's image is right on the top of the map in Vanolevu. And you will now hear from Samu Kurindrani, who will be speaking about his village of Namatakula, which is on the southwest of Vitilevu here, the midsection of the map on this screen. The community leaders have been asked to respond to 4 key questions. They what climate change impacts are happening in your community? What loss and damage is occurring? What is your community doing to address this? And what is your message to the COP26 presidency? I would now like to invite Samu Kurindrani to take the mic. And I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Donovan, everyone. Saloti, I believe the video for my presentation will be up shortly. I will just be briefly answering the 4 questions that is required to answer. Saloti will be sharing just a brief video of what's happening in Namatakula and what are we currently facing. Bulavinaka again, Dolovina to you all, listeners from around the world. I would like to share with you a short video and also a presentation of my village in Namatakula and what are the impacts that we're currently going through. Our first question was what climate change impacts are happening in Namatakula. One of the first that is affected by mostly all the frontline communities along the Coral Coast and other parts of Fiji is a rising sea level. This has caused coastal erosion along the beach in Amatakula, as you can will see through the video that is currently playing. And also the houses along the beach in Amatakula, which also includes a church, are frequently exposed to coastal floods during extreme storms, especially during the cyclone season, which is now November to April. Some of the faces coastal erosion in Amatakula worsens, and it has since the last 5 years. We've seen in the video coral bleaching, also due to increased ocean temperatures, which has an impact on the marine food chain, causing scarcity of fish and other seafood along the coast, which just means that our villagers have to now go further to the deeper ocean to actually get fish for the village. Also, flooding is one of the most recurrent problem that is happening in our village in Amatakula, and due to heavy rainfalls from the highlands, the floods usually affects the farmlands and also the village. As you can see in the video there is a build of sediments, which is caused of the all the sediments that were sent down from during the floods, and it has built it in front of the village beach. So during flood season and storm surge, the impacts are doubled and causing right wind impact onto the village due to flooding. Moving on to our second question, which is what are the loss and damage that is happening in our community? There is a possibility of a relocation for the village in the near future, which we are trying to avoid right now, and we're using traditional knowledge and traditional practices to actually combat the impacts of climate change. Worst case scenario, we might just be like any other community, like in Vunindongoloa and Narikoso, which have to be relocated due to climate change and the continuous impacts it has on our village. So what is our community doing to address this issue? First of all, one of the major projects that we've done, it was a fundraise by the youth. We managed to get our rivers diverted away from the front of the village. As you can see on the video, that there's been a build of island caused by flooding, sediments and all the activities that happen from the highlands, which has caused the impacts, which is worsened the flooding impacts into our village. So we diverted the river channel out to the ocean, and also practiced contour farming in our village of Namatakula. So we have actually shifted the farms up onto the hill slopes so that it does not get affected by the continuous flooding that is happening in our village. And also we had started with the coral farming project. We had planted 300 coral farms in our village in Namatakula. However, it is slowly rebuilding. We're still trying to get the assessment done by one of the experts of coral farming down in Vutua village to continue our project for coral farming. And also with the 450 meters nature-based seawall, which is currently under construction, that is thanks to the help of the British High Commission project, which is now carried out by the Ministry of Waterways. So the nature-based seawall will help reduce the impact of coastal erosion and storm surge, which will benefit about 70 to 80 households in my village of Namatakula. So our message to the COP26 presidency is that we have no time for illusory promises on climate action. We need world leaders to take responsibility to tackle climate change for the survival of humanity, because time is running out. Unless urgent action is taken to curb global warming, low-lying atolls, islands in the Pacific scattered across one of the world's 1/3 of the surface of the world could be submerged in the ocean by the end of the century. So we just need more on climate action. If there's any questions, you're more welcome to send me on the question. Vinaka.
Very powerful and important reflections there from Samu. I will now I will now move on to a pre-recorded video from Kelepi Saukitonga from Narikoso in Kandavu, who will share about his community's experience. So please give me a second while I pull up his video.
Mr. Kelepi, what climate change impacts are happening in your community?
Well, I live in a coastal community which has been encountered by sea level rise and coastal flooding and astronomical tides. That includes some of the biggest hurricanes which have been striking our community, which was being rated to category 4 and category 5.
What loss and damage, including non-economic losses, are happening in your community?
Well, the houses are being destroyed by the sea during sea level rise, and not only that, our natural resources too have been affected and being destroyed. Some of the fruit trees and the coastal line areas trees have been destroyed.
So far, what is your community doing to address this?
Well, our community doing rebuilding seawalls. So we've been putting some ways to do the seawalls in every mountain. We keep on building seawalls, putting up stones. Not only that, we planted mangroves too inside the seawall so that it can protect other families which live stayed in the old site. We care about the other families which they still live in the old site. And not only that, we've started to put some of our food security programs and some trainings through the villages, especially about the disaster management. And we've started to relocate families. Right now, we've relocated 7 families in Nairobi.
What is your message to the COP26 presidency?
Well, my message to the COP, if the development countries can have a look about where they put these 80% of emissions, they should have care about the smaller countries too. Not only the smaller countries, but the other countries which have been affected by the climate change. If they've causing these 80% of emissions, they should have well-financed and developed the other countries which were being affected by the climate change.
Naka, that was a video from Kelepi Soputonga from Marikoson on the island of Ono in the province of the Kaunrove. So we will now jump on to our final community leader, Petero Ngaloimbao from Tunolo and the Kaunrove. Petero is joining us from Glasgow at COP26. It's almost midnight in Glasgow, and so we thank Petero for joining us. Mulvinaka Kai, over to you. Petero, you're on mute. Can you just unmute, please?
Bulabnak everyone from freezing Glasgow. Yes, it's nearly midnight here, and I'm thankful for this opportunity. Okay, the effects of climate change in my community. We have been facing coastal erosion, a tsunami that happened back in 2010, and it actually was very effective that it took away my shop. We have continuously facing tidal waves, tropical cyclone, continuous flooding, intrusion of seawater into arable lands. And we have also discovered that there is changes in our seasonal weather pattern. We have, in order to do that, we know that we cannot combat the effects of climate change. So we have actually come up with adaptive methods to adapt to these changes. So we have set up a rehabilitation committee in our community. This rehabilitation committee has been effective in ways that we have managed to reforest our degraded grassland areas, and also we have been able to erect our own coastal areas through the replanting of trees, and also we have also rehabilitate our own coral reefs through the assistance of our local Ministry of Fisheries. The message that I'd like to put across the COP presidency is that time is not running out, time is no more. We've actually come up to the final effects of climate change. And the question is that I would like to put across the COP presidency: why should we suffer on small island developing states on the effects that they have caused us? The only message is compensate for the losses and damage that has caused us on a daily basis. Thank you.
Pinakabakalevu Petro, Pinakabakalevu to Kelepi and Samu as well. These are 3 of the many frontline villages in Fiji who are facing loss and damage and who are at high risk of being forcibly displaced from their homes, from their ancestral lands due to a number of direct and indirect climate change impacts. With very important key messages for our political leaders. Enough with the endless talks and more action now, particularly by developed countries on the need for financing for loss and damage to help them build resilience. So I will now invite Makareta Wangabonobono, who is working directly with these community leaders and many more to reflect on her work and to remind us why we're speaking about loss and damage today on this event. Bolobinaka Makareta, over to you. Ma, you are muted. I'm going to start sharing your screen now.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. Bulavinaka, everybody, members of the panel. Good to see you all. Namaste and warm greetings from Suva, Fiji. The stories of the vulnerable community representatives we just heard recount lived experiences of the climate impacts they witness daily, how they're coping and addressing the challenges they face. Given the hardship they endure, stories are told with dignity and grace. This is something that I would always admire with our frontline communities in rural areas. I'll address 3 aspects of the topic from community perspectives: loss and damage, including non-economic loss, and some intersecting topics, climate forced displacement, and the resilience of our communities. Loss and damage, simply put, refers to when the impacts of climate change go beyond what we can adapt to. That is when mitigation is insufficient and adaptation is inadequate. So loss from coastal erosion and flooding we've been hearing, from the sea level rise, from our earlier speakers, is irreversible. But damage to roads and other infrastructure after a cyclone may be repairable. So last week, Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley's powerful speech to world leaders was a stern reminder, and she raised critical climate issues from small developing states. On loss and damage, she said, failure to provide the critical finance in loss and damage is measured for us in lives and livelihoods in our communities. Now for SIDS, or small island developing states, we need global warming levels at 1.5 degrees to survive. Global levels stand at between 0.8 to 1.2 at the moment. Now that's a stark picture. As the planet heats up, we have seen the ravages of climate disasters, from intense cyclones like Winston, Harold, and Yasa in the Pacific. The severity of the damaged homes, infrastructure, and the environment, and from slow onset events like sea level rise, warming of our ocean, coastal flooding, and so on, led to many difficulties, hardship, like contamination of our groundwater, leading to food security issues, the destruction of our reefs, and many more. Hence, for us, in the Pacific, as small island states, talking about loss and damage is always very important to us, because it concerns our very survival. The tangible losses from these climate impacts have astronomical costs, as we all know. More often than not, it's our frontline communities who can least afford to bear the full brunt. The cost of one cyclone alone has been known to run into billions. TC Winston in 2016 affected 350,000 people, 31,000 homes, and 229 schools were lost or damaged. Until recently, some villages and children were still being housed and schooled in relief tents and makeshift shelters. Total damages from Winstons have been estimated at 1.4 billion US dollars, which comes to almost $3 billion Fiji dollars. Roughly about 30% of Fiji's GDP. Other cyclones, Harold, Yasa, and Anna, in the 2020 and 21 season have not been as costly, but they are still stern reminders for us when we are now in the cyclone season. So what then is non-economic loss? This is understood as tangible losses, the loss of things that are not normally traded in the markets. The absence of a market price creates a challenge in putting a value on non-economic loss. Example, health, identity, cultural heritage, and indigenous knowledge. Non-economic losses can come from slow onset events like sea level rise or extreme events like cyclones that I've just mentioned. Specific examples might include the inability of our coastal communities to live on their ancestral land and losses to their cultural tradition associated with this. Similarly, loss of guardianship to sacred sites. This is seen in one of the areas that Petero comes from, in the Tewa Bay. The loss of traditional fishing grounds and loss of traditional landmarks and sites, which are very important to indigenous people in Fiji. Now, there are gaps in information and data to map these intangible losses like customary heritage, wealth, and traditional knowledge, which is vital if we want to make a case for restitution in the future. Now, this is a contentious issue since the Paris Agreement exempts parties from liability. Aside from the difficulty of placing a value on the losses, there's also the difficulty of knowing what we have lost because of a lack of records. A pilot project in the Cook Islands sought to overcome this with distribution of tablets to people in communities to record the environment and the non-tangible losses they were witnessing. Climate force displacement and human mobility. This is also a very important area arising from the impacts, climate impacts we have been talking about and which our community leaders mentioned. So in the Pacific, climate force displacement is a reality. Displacement across national borders is relevant for our island atolls. No doubt they will speak about it from Tuvalu and Marshall when they speak. For Fiji, displacement occur within our national borders, with again the most affected being vulnerable coastal and riverine communities from either slow climate events such as sea level rise or extreme events caused by heavy flooding or frequent and intense tropical cyclones. Sadly, heavy flooding during the cyclone early this year wiped out one of our riverine villages in Bua in the north of Fiji. The Fiji government in 2016, in the lead up to COP23, announced that some 800 vulnerable coastal communities existed. In 2018, the minister responsible announced that 48 communities were prioritized for relocation. The forced displacement of our communities are often of people that can least afford to move. Relocation is also a result in the loss of people's ability to live on their ancestral lands, impacting on their cultural identity through loss of traditional and sacred sites and knowledge and practices associated. These kinds of losses are both economic and non-economic and impact on the enjoyment by affected communities of a range of human rights, including the rights of life to life, health, food, water, clean and healthy environment, and adequate standard of living, housing, property, self-determination, and development and culture. These are also acknowledged in the Fiji Constitution. Relocation costs are high and not affordable by our people. They have been funded by a combination of government and development agencies, and in one case, contribution by the community. So how resilient are our communities? What's happening to us? Resilience is defined by the IPCC as the capacity of social, economic, and environmental system to cope with hazardous event or trend or disturbances, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain the essential function. But I prefer my Google dictionary, which puts it more simply and understandable for us non-scientists. It says, resilience is the ability to withstand adversity and bounce back from the difficulty of life events. Resilience is important because it gives people the strength needed to process and overcome hardship. Being resilient doesn't mean that people don't experience stress, emotional upheaval, and suffering. While the resilience of our frontline communities is admirable, as recited by Mr. Kelepi, it has taken 8 years for the 7 houses in the red zone of his village, Narikoso, to be relocated to higher ground, with his people now undergoing capacity building and training in disaster management. Mr. Petero highlights the revival of traditional knowledge for agricultural practices and food security, awareness and training for before, during, and post-disaster periods. Mr. Kurindrani shows villages working together to divert rivers away from houses in the shoreline, planting of mangroves, and the building of nature-based seawalls at Namatakula village along the coral coast. In the community-based consultation involving reps from vulnerable communities, Unisinu in Rewa and Daku in Tailevu, impressive undertakings show that the impressive undertakings had been carried out with water channels, river dike, and floodgates to channel and divert water away from around the village to prevent overflows of water onto the village during high tides and heavy flooding. But these technology also require regular maintenance, and which is often not available. And who can forget the heart-wrenching case of Tukuraki village in the interior of Ba that was partially buried in a landslide, killing a family of 4, and most likely caused by intense rainfall and deforestation. The community was given 48 hours to vacate their village before another landslide occurred. It took 5 years of living in makeshift homes before the community was finally relocated to a permanent home site further inland. These random examples illustrate the resilience of our communities. However, with limited resources, outside assistance is needed to strengthen our resilience levels. So on the national level, more equitable resource sharing is vital for our communities, such as the inclusion of women, disabled, and other marginalized groups in consultations, training, and capacity building. Further, while Fiji may be leading in the formulation of climate laws, policies, and plans, such as our National Adaptation Plan, Displacement Relocation Guidelines, and the newly passed Climate Change Act a few months ago, often these are developed by consultants with little real consultation with people on the ground, people who will implement them or on whose behalf they are made. Greater awareness on these laws and plans are now required. So looking ahead, for small island developing states anxiously rely on the negotiations taking place in Glasgow to be successful, and major industrialized states to cut emission levels and adapt so that we may keep 1.5 degrees possible to protect our communities and environment. Our prayers are with them. Finance is critical for Pacific seats because we are witnessing and living with climate impacts daily, and which cause our losses and damage to our livelihood environment needed for our survival from a climate crisis that we did not cause. So mobilizing finance committed for adaptation and loss and damage, finding new sources of loss and damage finding we encounter now, and ensuring that this reaches our frontline communities is critical for our survival. Lastly, strengthening the resilience of our communities is vital, but also require mapping what is happening nationally and on the ground to align with how our frontliners are coping. These are the key asks, and I also amplify the demands by Pacific CSOs like PICAN and Youth for Pacific on loss and damage that they refer to in their documents. Naksalote.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and framing our discussion. Yes, so folks, these are very clear demands and very key asks here on this last slide. I heard many important things, one of which is the need for on the ground and meaningful engagement of those on the front lines like Kelepi and Samu and Petero, because they are the ones that know what works best. And also, thank you, Makarata, for reminding us that yes, we're able to withstand adversity and bounce back. We've been doing it for generations, but we do need resources to support our resilience. And this here on this slide is a clear ask to our leaders in Glasgow for that. So I'll now stop sharing, and I will invite our leader from Tuvalu to come on to the screen, Maina Talia. Maina, if you can unmute your screen, what is Tuvalu's experience with loss and damage? And I know Maina has a video to share, so please let me know, Maina, when to start that.
Thank you so very much, Salote, for those kind words, and especially the brief introduction, and those who talked before me, especially Ma for setting the scene, and also giving a very strong background to what we are talking about today. Can I kindly ask Salote to view the to pull up the video, please? It's only a 1 minute one.
Sure.
That was during Cyclone Pam in 2015. Salote?
Yep.
Oh, the video went off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you, Charlotte. Colleagues, friends, what you have seen is the effect of climate change that we are facing in Tuvalu, especially in relation to sea level rise. We continue to witness the intensity and the frequency of drought, storm surges, and soil erosion. But in 2018, during my tenure with Tango, UUSC supported our climate-induced migration workshop with the hope to develop an outcome document for our communities on the issue of climate-induced migration. Leaders of all island communities in Funafuti, youth, people with disabilities, women, and our elders were part of the discussion. The whole idea is to give them the freedom to speak their mind and voice their opinions of their fears and hopes on what actions must be taken to ensure life continuity on the island. For them, migration shall be the very last resort for Tuvalu. Hence, we already witnessed the intent of displacement of people, especially during 2015, when Tuvalu was badly struck by Cyclone Pam. Our community approach to address climate change, apart from what the government are doing at the moment, community are utilizing traditional knowledge to address climate change. And that is significant for us, given the limited resources that we have. That is always our fallback position in terms of addressing climate change. We fall back on our traditional knowledge to ensure that we are ready to respond to climate change. I think our simple message for COP26, it's very simple. We should not just look at 1.5 degrees Celsius as a number, but we should look beyond what lies behind 1.5 degrees. The likely loss of people, the likely loss of culture, the likely loss of cultural identity. Those are all the things that are associated with the 1.5 degrees. So our leaders, those who are in the negotiation room, international community, lead negotiators from industrialized countries, they should not just look at 1.5 as a number, but look beyond what lies beyond the 1.5 is people, the cost of climate adaptation, and also finance that is really are needed by our community to address loss and damage, and also the non-economic loss and damage. Thank you so much. Would love to engage further in question Q&A.
Nakbale Reminder, thank you for sharing your message and for reminding us that for Tuvaluans, migration is the last resort. And for our leaders at Glasgow to look beyond what lies behind 1.5. And that part of that will already include loss of damage for many in the Pacific. So Nakbale for that message. Let's move on now to our brother from the Marshall Islands, Mr. Mark Steggy, who is joining us today from Majuro, I believe. Yakwema, can you share briefly about the Marshall Islands experience with loss and damage?
Yahweh Audip. Thank you, Salate and Ma, for organizing this amazing event and allowing a little voice out here in the Pacific to contribute to such a worthwhile global effort to tackle a challenge that is really a crisis at this stage. So I've been kind of thinking of how to discuss such an important topic as loss and damage, and be sensitive to the actual losses and damages that are already happening, and not try to quantify things too much. It is, however, how I approach the work. I'm a researcher. I do vulnerability assessments, and as a way to kind of humanize my work as much as possible, I want to talk a little bit about what I how much I believe that engagement of communities in the collection, analysis, ownership of climate data that we're going to be collecting over these coming 10, 20 years, how important that is, the process of conducting that climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning. So to kind of help me do that, I was, thinking of how I was looking at some of my original writings on the topic. Comes under the title Atoll Habitability Thresholds, and you can find it online. But and I also kind of looked back at something that I wrote in 2012, kind of more of a reflective piece. So I'm going to be reading from sections of that today, and I hope I stay under 10 minutes or less. Around 10,000 years ago, while a group of 29 high volcanic islands crumbled back below the surface of the Central Pacific, little tiny pulps banded together to form massive coral reef colonies, now known as the Coral Atoll Nation of the Marshall Islands. My parents kept a small retail store on one of the 29 atolls when I was very young. And from breakfast to lunch to dinner, without stopping for lunch, I would swim and play with my cousins, and right beside manta rays, jumping clear out of the water. And off to the side, a World War II relic called the Terushima Maru, just sunk already and listing to port. And I still remember falling to sleep, imagining that World War II freighter guiding itself closer to the shore. These are the memories of my youth. And thinking of it now, I am transported back to one specific day, swimming out on that pier when pink and orange clouds were bedazzling the horizon, and it was getting close to dinner again. A few of us still remained after another full day of swimming, reluctant to go home. And I sat transfixed by the fleeting sun when a bright green flash of light suddenly burst out just as the sun sank below the waves. And I was unsure of how refracted light could emit green amongst such different colors as pink and orange. And I've only seen the green flash that one time, so I know it is rare. It may be too late for my people to hold back inundation, storm surges, erosion, and other processes that are now amplified by climate change. But for now, the way I see it, this is my 2012 voice, but perhaps still true. Climate change for us will boil down to ensuring healthier coastlines, more sustainable methods of existence in our islands, and preparing our children to articulate their own imperiled future on or off of these islands. There is much work to do to prepare our children. And I'm gonna now kind of talk a little bit about how I envision that work and some of the work that I'm doing now with organizations that are co-hosting this event. So as I mentioned, I do vulnerability and adaptation planning as a work. In fact, the ADB, Asian Development Bank, allowed me to work with my sister Tina Steggy, who's there in Glasgow, and a couple other people to do a vulnerability assessment of our water sector here in the urban atoll of Madro. So I'm really glad to kind of see some of these same players kind of working together, and of course my sister Yawetina. So those vulnerability and adaptation assessments are really kind of overlooked as opportunities to mitigate losses in a loss and damage conversation. So the work at hand is significant, as I mentioned. There's a lot of vulnerability assessments that need to be conducted in the Marshalls. Only 15% of the country, I would say, has actually been assessed properly. And there is a risk that the capacity gap between outside experts and community actors will broaden to increasing information. And so the expertise surrounding climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning will grow, and that itself will become a loss, an unintended one, but something that we in the Marshalls have definitely experienced with past research conducted in our islands surrounding the nuclear legacy, and atolls completely uninhabitable now, and areas of the country that we still don't have full information about some of the data surrounding the contamination there. So kind of learning from that history and trying to, again, get more engaged in the work at hand of climate vulnerability assessments. So within the context of communities facing displacement, which is a real big driver of my work. So if we don't have community engagement, this may lead to disempowerment of the communities themselves. And these communities are already experiencing a lot of unemployment and poverty. So, climate change, for all of its difficult and terrible implications for our people, maybe can have some silver lining and allow us, through the emergence of indigenous and Western methods of understanding the risks of climate change, allow us to become better stewards of our environment, to understand our island so well that we can prolong our time here in this place and live the best lives that we can here. And in so doing, become quite skilled in the process of ecosystem monitoring or water quality and quantity monitoring, these skills that are transferable to other places around the world that we could now understand, utilize, and apply in our work here or elsewhere. So hopefully this will be a loss that we don't add to the number of other losses that we are anticipating, the loss of opportunity to engage our communities in the climate work at hand. So thank you very much. That would be my ask, is that we do engage local communities in the design and use of data-driven strategies for adaptation. There will be adaptation limits, and that's where I think loss and damages come into play, but those limits are, as we mentioned earlier, also non-economic in nature. They're capacity-based, and hopefully we can manage the losses better through more community engagement. So thank you, everyone. And I'll put a link in the chat on some of the work that we're doing here in the Marshalls, supported by the UUSC. Good
Mark, thank you for sharing your story with us and for reminding us how much beauty lies in the Pacific, which is also what we risk losing as an aspect of non-economic loss and damage. and as a youth, how you were able to envision resilience, which many of our youths in Glasgow are also doing today. So thank you for that. What I also heard is the importance of how the engagement of communities is important, is critical in climate data. And thank you also for reminding us about, the legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands and how climate change impacts are bringing to the surface not only nuclear waste that was buried, but also the question of responsibility of addressing this impact, which is also a key factor as we speak about loss and damage, financing and responses. So thank you very much for that, Mark. I now invite our brother Langi, who is the Climate Justice Project Officer from the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, which is a regional organization. And Langi is also joining us today from Glasgow. Bolovinaka and Yandra, Langi, I think it's midnight, after midnight there. What is PICAN's position and advocacy on loss and damage at COP26?
And thank you, Salate, and to the team for organizing this very useful session. I'd like to begin by saying, I was born in the year 1992, and that's when the UNFCCC was set up. When they had the first discussion in Rio, we've had, 26 COP ever since. And I think the discussions within the UNFCCC has evolved from, formerly it was mitigation. They were speaking a lot about, mitigating the climate crisis, and then we came to a point where, countries started to realize that they were experiencing different levels of the climate impacts, at the national level, at the regional level, and so from adaptation, we are now at a point where we are we're in an era actually we are seeing firsthand not only the climate impacts, but we're also experiencing loss and damage, irreversible loss and damage, which many of my fellow panelists have talked on previously. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I'm going to share briefly some of the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network's position on this particular topic. And one of the things is we've brought together through a very consultative process different collected viewpoints and feedbacks and positions from civil society organization across the region, and we've formulated a Pacific Pacific climate demands, which is something we are bringing with us here to Glasgow and pushing here at the negotiation and also in other spaces outside of the negotiations. So one is that we want to see that parties must decide on the full operationalization of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage at COP26 without any delay or deferment, including a governance structure defining what the SNLD, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, is something that must be action focused implementation arm of the Warsaw in the WIME, Warsaw implementation mechanism that operates independently of the WIM executive committee. We are demanding that a direct and inclusive response mechanism to Pacific country request that goes well beyond just a launching of a website or a hands-off matchmaking system. So we want to see that it's fully resourced financially, and then technically, and there are also an operational structure that allows for the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage to begin its work immediately, yeah, including a secretariat with staffing and funding. So the urgent establishment of a loss and damage finance facility with new additional needs-based and predictable finance that's targeted and channeled to vulnerable people who need it the most, including in the Pacific, that does not, compete for limited resources within the existing mechanism. So that's what we are also demanding for. You're also demanding that parties must agree to establish a permanent agenda item on loss and damage so that it is considered at each session of the subsidiary bodies, and also to raise the political profile of the issue at every future COP. So those are some of the sort of key top line messages or positions that Pacific civil society are pushing for here at COP. But I also would like to, take this opportunity to provide some insights from here in terms of some of the outcomes from the first week of COP. So, for a very, a little and formally a little and unmentioned issue, we've been hearing now from very interesting new voices on the issue of loss and damage. So it's emerging from extensive media coverage on loss and damage, from, there's a lot of momentum behind it, the visibility of the issue and the growing understanding of what it means. We've seen this at least emerging in the first week. So while we don't have an outcome language in the outcome of this conference, we as civil society, as Climate Action Network, we are seeing this as sort of a litmus test for success. We will have to look at how we also escalate this issue in terms of our actions, and also how we land in the text as well. And obviously, there are pushback on loss and damage reference by certain big countries, the US, the EU, and so they're focusing on the fact that the messaging should be on the process, but most of the developing countries pushing that must not only be on the process, but also should be on process and the intent. This week, we sort of saw the gates or the floodgates beginning to open on loss and damage. So we saw, Antigua and Barbuda signing a historic accord with Tuvalu that will clear way for small, island states to sue major developed nations for severe damages that are caused by climate change. We saw, this finance pledge from the Scottish government to fund, loss and damage. And it helped developing countries deal with loss and damage from climate change. And, there are also calls to reopen, Article 51 of the Paris Agreement. Vanuatu government, who's, actively pushing the call to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. So there's a lot of work that's being done within, to push these loss and damage agenda within the UNFCCC, but also outside of that. So I think the Pacific and many Pacific small island developing states and countries are saying, what they're saying is, if the UNFCCC doesn't deal with this, loss and damage, then we'll take it outside and seek, use, explore, the any means possible to, for reparations for loss and damage, to hold developed countries accountable for them to pay for, the loss and damages that many vulnerable and frontline countries and communities have already, experienced. So I guess those are some of the insights as well that I probably would like to share. And so that's all. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to that. Thank you.
Nakalangi for your message and for all the work you're leading at PICAN. And thank you for taking the voices of the Pacific to COP. That sounds amazing. I heard, some very clear calls. Parties must operationalize the Santiago Network on loss and damage, and that it be action focused, operating independently of the WIMEX-COM, a loss and damage fund that is accessible to those who are already facing loss and damage, including the Pacific, and then loss and damage be part of all future COPs. That's, I think, is really important. I'm also encouraged to hear that there are, many emerging voices on loss and damage at the COP. And we certainly hope as well that the final negotiation text will reflect these key action items. And also very proud to see, Pacific leadership inside the UNFCCC, but also outside to secure processes for reparation and accountability. That's really great. So that ends our panelists. Pinaka level to everyone and to our community leaders for joining. For those in Glasgow, it's early morning. We've heard a lot of impacts of climate change from our panelists, but we've also heard their resilience. The fact that they're leading this work and coming together today and supporting each other already reflects, a core spirit that we share in the Pacific, and that is our boldness, our solidarity, and our unwavering courage to be resilient in the face of the most challenging and unprecedented crisis of our generation. That is already, as you've heard, causing loss and damage. So to our political leaders gathering in Glasgow, particularly to the developed countries of the world, we challenge you to be bold and to be courageous in your words and in your actions today, and to make meaningful change and progress that effectively and adequately and carefully and equitably addresses the existential risks that our Pacific is experiencing. So before we open up to Q&A, I'd like to give our panelists 1 minute each to share what gives you hope as we fight for the resilience of our Pacific and our people. So let's start with Samu. Drew, are you still there? Do you mind unmuting? And I think Samu is taking a break. Petero, 1 minute, what gives you hope?
Naka, my hope is with a partnership, with engagement and a collaborative initiative, we would be able to push forward in regard to loss and damage. I think, yes, it's the collaborative and engagement of our affected communities with stakeholders that would enable us to push forward. Pinaka.
Pinaka Petero, Makirata?
Yeah, I guess I found very, very positive work being done in Glasgow this past week, and it's giving me hope.
Thank you, Mark. Makirata?
When we look into our history, the Pacific, we all can see the resilience of our people from, from the colonial era till now. And so that gives me hope that we'll be able to pull through during this crisis, but we really need our leaders, political leaders, to be bold in Glasgow. So I also am very, very encouraged by our youths and with people like Maina, Langi, and others. Oh, I mentioned Maina. Maina, you're not in the youth category, maybe. Just joking. And so that really, I've just been tracking. This is the first time I'm really tracking COP. I've only been to 2 COPs, but I feel like I'm doing more now in understanding what's going on in COP than when I was actually there. So it gives me great hope to see what the youths are doing. Thank you.
Nakama. Samu?
Well, I think my hope is that we need to work effectively and collaboratively and act immediately on climate action. Simple as that. Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yep. Vinaka,
apologies. Thank you. Vinaka.
Maina. Mina, you are muted. What gives you hope? Right, Mina must have fallen asleep because it's after midnight. Langi?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Makereta. I'm really, optimistic. What gives me hope, sense of hope, is young people, the drive, the ambition, and their work to hold their own governments accountable, the work to for their governments to deliver more ambitious outcomes, because it's their future and their children's future which is at stake. And I think that's where these, they've come to recognize that that's where the real power lies. It's not with, it's, the negotiators and the leaders, they do their own work, but the real power actually lies with the people. And I think as they're shifting that power from the bottom up, we're starting to see government change their positions, change their policies, etc. And I think, it's very encouraging to see the work of many young people across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Langi. Mina, if you can hear us, do you mind unmuting? Otherwise, we have a question here from Christine that I'd like to jump to. Okay, I think he is asleep. So the question from Christine is, Christine, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, hi, Salote. Hello, panelists. Just to say that this is just such a wonderful event. So just very quickly to the question, we've been talking about bold actions. So my question is, what bold action needs to be taken by our own Pacific governments to ensure that any displacement is carried out with dignity?
Great question. Thank you, Christine. Makereta and Langi and Mark, or and Samu and Petero. Who wants to take that question? Mark, go ahead. Can you unmute?
As you know, we have been working with displaced communities, in particular 8 communities around Fiji from different parts of Fiji. And in 2019, we had our first convening. Thanks to UUSC for having supported our work. And what we found was that was the first time that these displaced communities were coming together to discuss. And for me, it was quite a learning experience. And so I think, a lot is going on the ground that we don't know, for those of us, in the CSOs and other development agencies. And I think, we should listen carefully to what is being done and what is being said on the ground. On the basis of that, we actually formulated some of their asks. And it's a long process because, as you know, since we've had the pandemic, we have not been able to go back. We were supposed to have our convening this year in September, but that had to be shelved. But I don't think there's any easy answer to that, because at the moment, I look around and I see that there's just no money. It took 8 years for Narukoso relocation to happen, and then only 7 houses. And reading the documents that led up to that, it is quite a task, and therefore there's a lot to be done on the ground to really understand the process that's happening there.
Nakama. Langi, are you still on? Do you want to answer that question? And I only ask Langi because he's in Glasgow. And Petero as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think our governments need to really push this at the multilateral space. Even here in Glasgow, they need to work within the groupings, the G77 plus the AOCs, to ensure that loss and this particular topic is brought to that particular space. But in terms of displacement being carried out with dignity, I believe that community consultations are integral, because we've heard, because the question is asking about our displacement is being carried out with dignity, and I know that for many communities it's a really hard choice to move, and it's actually one of the last option that they would like to explore. I know that there was a community where the grandmom was saying that even though they're experiencing the worst possible impact of sea level rise, they're not going to move. They're going to stay there. So I think it requires extensive consultation with the community that's involved, including women and girls and youth, indigenous communities, because we've also seen from some of the case studies how people, as they relocated, it hasn't worked out well for some of these groups. The design of the houses, or has not worked well for women, etc. So it is, yeah, it's one of those last measures to pursue, and it will require extensive community consultation. Yeah, that's what I think government should ensure.
Thank you, Langi. And I would just add, human dignity and human rights are key in everything. It starts from planning, from policy development, from the implementation. Even when they go to these multilateral spaces to do advocacy, they must center that in everything that they do. And in the Pacific, outside of Fiji and the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu, there are communities who are today still without any assistance for their relocations. In Papua New Guinea, we've had partners who have been displaced and who have started the relocation, but a majority of their community are still living in their original land, and they're facing severe food scarcity, water insecurity, and so forth. So I think what it means for me, for the Pacific Island leaders to be bold, is to come together. I think being in solidarity, despite all our issues, being in solidarity for the purpose of serving those who are on the front lines is an important aspect. I think aside from some of the more multilateral spaces, regionalism is key. I think it's very important, particularly when it comes to displacement. And I think they need to put their heads together to come up with something that works for all. I also think that, like Langi mentioned, community engagement is important, but I think they need to really break that down and see what and identify what that means policy-wise, because it's not just about community consultations, having meetings every month. It's about engaging communities meaningfully and listening to them and understanding what they need, and then designing that from the scratch, not bringing in something that's a template and sort of adjusting that to meet our Pacific's identity and unique cultures. So a lot of responses there, Christine. I hope it answers your question. Petero, yes, please, Petero, jump in.
Yes, Vinaka, I think most of you have answered that. I would actually answer that from my experience as a community representative living there in the community. I have found out that there hasn't been and there is timely assistance regarding the consultations. For example, from my village in the Kondrove, we have been advised that we are one of the prioritized village that needs to be relocated. That was like 10 years back. Ever since, from then till now, there hasn't been any follow-up to that research, that study that was conducted by the climate section of prior to pre-COP21. That hasn't been followed up. There hasn't been any plan or whatsoever. So we are being left there. There hasn't been any follow-up. I think the approach as of now from the government is still that top-down approach. There hasn't been any bottom-up approach. However, they have mentioned that we should engage in that bottom-up approach, but that hasn't been implemented. Speaking from the experiences that I have back in the community, since we're facing this and we're actually trying to motivate and build ourselves around the idea that we're going to be relocated, and yet we are liaising with the provincial office, with the Department of Forestry, with the Fisheries Department to help us to rehabilitate our coastal areas. That has not been done. So speaking from the experience of a community representative, there is timely assistance and no assistance at all regarding the relocation and loss and damage activities back in the communities.
Maina, if you can hear us, Makireta has a question or wonders if you can respond to Christine's question about migration. Okay, no response from Maina. So just asking the panelists and also the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please include it in the chat or just unmute and we can respond to it. Go ahead, Christine.
Thank you, Salote, and thank you everyone for those great responses. I think what I just want to comment here is, and which also ties into the relocation and displacement with dignity, is when you have this long list of villages that government has said that they will relocate, and that they set a target, to relocate this, and they put that as part of their KPIs, for instance. And then, so the process ensuring with dignity, with their rights are considered kind of, is sidelined just for them to achieve a quota of how many communities they'll be relocating and announce this to the world. I think, we need to ensure that this does not happen, that they just do not tick the box in terms of communities that they have relocated. Thank you.
Like a Christine, yep, absolutely. Thank you. Ma, did you want to say something? No.
Is that Mark or Ma?
Ma and Mark. No? Okay.
Yes, I think that's a very important point that Christine raises. I think we have a slight problem with Fiji's position in that we seem to believe that we can come out with all these plans and laws and plot out how many of our people are vulnerable and all that. But there's not much that's connecting from the top to the ground. And there's a real need for us to understand each other and to show the people that we are genuine about what's happening. I mean, the classic example is we had our youths marching in support of what's happening in Glasgow, and the police shuts them down. I mean, I don't think the police even understood what they were doing. So there's a lot of disconnect happening in this country, And just from social media, if you read what's happening, I mean, I have some very enlightened friends on the on Facebook, and when I'm reading what they're saying, it's quite clear that they really have not kept up and don't understand the issues, what the issues are. And there's some interesting things going on, being put forward by the government in terms of funding, pushing finance and all that. And we are belittling that process, So there's a hell of a lot of awareness that we need to do, ACG, because although we may be so advanced in one aspect, that hasn't caught up with the population. Thank you.
Yeah, Vinaka Christine, Vinaka Mar. So we're at 7:54. I don't see any other questions. So I just want to maybe wrap this up and thank everyone again for joining. Again, thank you, Christine, and folks at GIZ for organizing this and for inviting us to take up this space. Thank you, Makereta, for inviting us to join and share our voices here. Nakawakalevu, Petero, and Samu, and Mark, and Mina, and everybody, and Langi for joining from Glasgow this early in the morning. I'd like to close off with just, sort of a call to action, I guess, again, to our leaders at Glasgow. We've heard a lot about, especially to our Pacific Island leaders, I think. I've seen a lot of actions on social media about the many messages that you're sharing. It's so inspiring to see that our leaders from the Pacific are speaking up boldly and courageously. And I guess my ending sentiments, as we've heard from this Q&A, is that we want to see that at home as well. Upholding rights and upholding human dignity doesn't lie only in the words that we say, but it's in the actions that we do. And our government, as our political leaders, must enforce that and do that at home. So we look forward to our leaders coming back home and seeing what real action we can do together with communities in the center and on the front lines. So with that, I thank you all and I bid farewell. More there, everyone. Thank you. Bye, Langi. Go to sleep. And Petro.
Thank you.
More everyone.
Bye.
Bye.